This is the current skyline of Singapore. If you visit Singapore, this is what you see. And I think as we touch down in Singapore, we'll think, yeah, this might be Utopia. But the whole basis of the planning of Singapore is actually arise out of pure necessity. I think using very clever and intelligent economic instruments, Singapore has been able to attract investments and to build itself up from basically a fishing village about 50 years ago. So it's also a story about transformation. We always start by locating Singapore. We are in Southeast Asia. A lot of people think we are from China. We are part of China, but we are not really China. We might want to be China, but we are not. And Singapore is really tiny. It's 53 kilometers in breadth and 34 kilometers on the north-south axis. I think just running around Singapore is entirely possible by all the ultra-marathon people. When Singapore is planned for 6.5 million people, and the land area is 710 square kilometers. So if you multiply that by 1,000 times, theoretically you could house the entire world's population. Actually now it's 7 billion, but at the time when we made this thesis, it's actually 6.5 billion people, and you would need 710,000 square kilometers of land. And that is really equivalent to only 0.5% of the Earth's land area. And that is actually all of Texas, maybe 2 of Italy's and 2 of Japan, and a small little part of China. So what is it like to imagine a world like this? I think certainly we are not advocating for every city to be like Singapore, but we are just trying to provoke an idea about how compact living could be. And Singapore is actually a nation, so all the facilities and infrastructure needed for a country is also what you would need to put into this city. So it's more than just a city. It has all the amenities that's required by a country. The total footprint, building footprint in Singapore is shockingly only 13% of the land area, out of which housing takes up a proportion of that, and it's really 87% developed by the government and only 13% by the private sector. So that accounts for why the prices are really climbing very high, because there is a very small percentage of private housing. But home ownership is actually very high, it's 90%. And this is one of the key sort of social factor that makes the housing project sustainable, because it prioritizes ownership over rental. And if you look at the land size of Singapore, we have grown about 22% from 1959. In roughly the same period, the population has increased 271%. So, we were in Alan's lecture from just now, and in comparison, Guangzhou's land has grown 700% and the population proportionately doubled. And in terms of city density, urban density, Singapore is not really that dense. It's somewhere in the middle. We have cities that are extremely dense, like Dhaka and Manila, that are looking at 4 or 5 times more dense than Singapore. But the kind of urban model that we are looking at in Dhaka and some of these cities that we're looking at, they're all like a low to mid-rise typology. And I think when Singapore was planned in the early days, there was a push for height, because I think some of the examples of some of this low-rise, high-density development potentially could create, cities of darkness like what we see in Kowloon Wall City. So the aim for height is actually a conscious one. It is not that a low-rise urbanism could not sustain the density that Singapore is at, but it is a conscious design decision to go high. And the way the population, because the housing project is a huge one, is to house 87% of 6.5 million people. You need a lot of houses. From from zero, literally. The Housing and Development Board, which is HDB, thought that, they could crack up the entire big problem into tinier problems. And so this is also a little presentation about scales. At the new town level, we planned for 150,000, 250,000 people, which is then broken up into 4 or 5 neighborhoods of 30,000 people each, and then that is broken down into 2,000 to 3,000 persons per precinct. And then you string this pattern or this collection of cities around a large water catchment area using a mass rapid transit system. So if you look at the red dots, that's where the stations are, and the yellow is really where the new towns are. There are about 22 new towns to date. I'm going to follow with a series of slides that actually takes a look at one of these new towns. It's not the newest, but it's still something that's in progress. It's Sengkang on the northeastern side of Singapore. So the area highlighted is the entire new town, roughly about 10 square kilometers, with a planned population of 156,000, currently looking at about 80,000 to 90,000 persons living in this new town. The area highlighted is one neighborhood. So in this particular new town, you have 5 neighborhoods. And this is one of the neighborhoods, and this is cracked up into 6 or 7 smaller precincts. Each of the new towns will have its own facilities on the town level, which were then repeated on the neighborhood level and down to the precinct level. And in the precinct level, this is where individual architects will come in to work on the plot of land, and there are various different blocks and types, architectural typologies being experimented. This is a bird's eye view of one of the oldest town centers, which is also really the transportation hub for buses, interchanges for mass rapid transit railway systems, and libraries and town parks. This is a picture of Bishan Town Park, where they turned the concrete canal into a new river. Fishes are coming back, the children are now playing in the river. So in a kind of interesting return back to our origins, this was originally a river, got polluted, a concrete canal was created, and then now, 40 years later, demolish the concrete canal, put in high-tech membranes, and recreate a natural river that then cleans the water and brings back biodiversity and life. We have stadiums for every new town, large recreational spaces, libraries, religious buildings that kind of work harmoniously together depending on the demographic of each of the new town. All the neighborhoods are actually connected by a light rail transit. So you can literally walk from your block to the light rail transit, connect to the center, which will then take you on a island-wide mass rapid transit. So very, very connected and tightly integrated model. Every precinct will have its own little precinct garden. So if you look at this sampling of the different types of architectural expression in the precincts, and how these precincts there are different types of blocks. I think if you wanted to do any kind of high-rise study or research, you could come to Singapore and you could see all these different blocks, and they are all naturally ventilated with lots of cross-ventilation and lighting, and they have been around, some of them, for 40 or 50 years. And the project that we are going to zoom in on is on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. This is something that we'll talk a little bit in detail about. The current HDB plot ratio is 2.8 to 3, and this is what it looks like. It seems extremely dense. The latest proposition, after 40 years of constant development, which is still ongoing at the moment, this is a project that continues. It's not something that has stopped. they also, the HDB or the National Development Ministry also found that people were living away from the city and the city is dying at night. So they thought that in year 2002 that they wanted to bring more people back into the city. So a competition was organized. It's an international competition. And our scheme was very fortunately selected for as the winning project, which we then completed 2 years ago. So this is a project that has 7 blocks connected by public parks and gardens on the 26th and 50th story. A plot ratio of 9.1, which means that you literally take 3 of these usual HDB estates and stack them up one on top of the other. And at this kind of density, which we call super density, we can house actually the entire population of 6.5 million people in Singapore in one skinny long building over the mass rapid transit line. So we have about 160 kilometers of mass rapid railway lines, and if we built on top of this, the Duxton, we could house the entire population. And actually you do not really need cars and all the other amenities, given that we are able to sort of realize this imaginary or provocative architectural model.
Just start talking about the project itself. So when we first got the competition pack, as what Pei Ming has actually described to you, there wasn't any 50-story residential block that we could actually go and take a look in Singapore itself. Of course, we have Hong Kong and nearby Southeast Asian countries, but within Singapore, there wasn't any. So what we did was we went to an existing block that you see here in the picture, and we tried to imagine what it was like to put in 1,800 plus units at 50 stories, and it's really a question of dealing with density and mass. This is what it looks like at a typical 12-story block, and if we try to imagine what the current HDB blocks are stacked upon itself, it could really look like that. So we're looking at a site area of 2.5 hectares and 1,848 units. So what happens is we focus a lot on the ground itself, because if you look at a 50-story footprint for a 50-story building, that really means that it's only about 17% site coverage, which means that a lot of the ground is liberated. So we thought of the ground as an organizing surface where it becomes a mediator for the public and private realm. It's where the social spaces are. We'll have the urban connections, and of course the green lung, lots of green, we love green, and commercial institutional facilities, sports, and of course the car parks and roads as well. But what we have then is that with such high density, it's going to be a huge competition of that ground space with the car parking and all the M&E spaces. We needed 1,100 car parks just to fit into this particular project. So we came up with the idea that we wanted a kind of, the ground strategy that we came up with was to do a slice and a lift. And when we do that, what happens is that with the slice and lift, what it does, it can house all the car parking in a minimum level of basements, because again, this is social housing, public housing, and we need to look at the cost effect of whatever scheme that we put up. And with a cut and slice, it also helps us stitch back to the existing networks and also be the connection to the new network within the site, which is the lift systems up to the public bridges as well. And the site is nicely located between two of the MRT station, the train stations, and linked by a linear park. So there was an opportunity to actually bring the park into our new ground. So that's actually a picture of the actual building. So on this new green or new ground, we actually put in layers of paths and then layer of greens, and of course there's a tree layer. which works on more of a layered in heights and types of trees as well, so that at certain perspectives or angles viewed within, on top of the new ground, would be lush greenery. And within and on top of that will be plug-ins of pavilions and other activities that can happen there. And this is a view of it when it's just completed, so the trees are a little bit small still in this photo, but you can see the graphic of what we're trying to achieve here with the tower blocks on top of it. And these are the linkways, and within the green itself, we still continue to do the land peels, so that then it creates within a large green space multiple spaces that can be viewed from different levels. So part of the competition brief is to actually acknowledge 2 blocks that were actually built by the government and promised to the people in the 1960s. And we needed to pay homage to these blocks. So what we did was to add in an additional layer to these, to the new ground. And these are actually, that's an image of the old blocks here. And what we did was to transform them into sort of a light tube and with panels sort of explaining the history of the public housing in Singapore and turn it into sort of an exhibition, outdoor exhibition area. So on the blocks itself, I think we went through sort of many iterations on how the blocks could be placed. And what we needed, what we were quite sure was to actually maximize the views, maximize the block spacing, and also look at bringing the green from the linear green park into the space itself. So what we actually finally come up with is actually a mixture of point blocks in sort of a slat block, so that you have that kind of porosity happening, and the placement of these blocks would be sensitive to take the context itself. So the blocks are actually designed as the towers are super efficient to maximize the number of units that we can actually build on the site. And the nice thing about linking them and stringing them up means that it became quite easy and fell into place in terms of the infrastructure planning of the site itself.
We felt for sure that the building is going to be a massive building, is going to be big, and we know at once that you can't deny the bigness and the massiveness of it. But we thought, architecturally we could reduce the perceived mass and density of the building, and we thought that vertical lines, similar to how waterfalls, have that softness to it. And at that time, I think the movie The Matrix started to visualize our whole physical environment, being defined by codes, and we thought that if we could atomize the entire building into small little components and then reassemble them into a new kind of architectural expression, then we could avoid the homogeneity or the sameness of repetition, and all this to be done within a very tight sort of cost parameters. We also felt that we needed to allow aging in place, so the flats actually need to be designed for maximum flexibility. So in this instance, we have actually created zones for structural location, and within these zones to then allocate solid and glass panels, keeping a very tight control on the percentage of glass and concrete. And then we added layers of architectural features like bay windows and balconies and planter boxes to create a diverse, within a 500 meter sort of depth, to create a huge diversity, so that every unit almost became a individual unit that's very different, and together they form almost like a fabric. And we were thinking about Frozen music and all of this kind of artistic expression to be involved in as part of our sort of very, very technical and very undifferentiated way of producing a building. So we ended up with 5 different building types, integrating like rainwater downpipes, beams, and columns into the panels. And these are all cast off-site and with 4 gable ends, and these are then hoisted in place. This is a mock-up of 1 floor. We ended up with 7 different floor types, which are then put together. This is a logistic chart made by the contractor on delivery and program on how these are being put together. So this is an image of how the cores go up and then the panels go in. And when we put it all together, this is what we have: 7 blocks, very sort of 90% prefabricated, stitched together by bridges.
Okay, lots more to go, and 10 minutes been flagged. Units. So I think Pei-Ming's really talked about how we wanted flexibility of units because the demographic of the type of buyers coming in are young couples starting their young families, and we'd like to think that it can grow and change as they live in that space. So with the peripheral columns, we can actually, this is actually just the base unit here, and we like to think that, at some point in time, you have that flexibility to design whatever units to whatever you fancy. So these are just quick shots about the show sales gallery and show units to show how the buyers could actually envisage their living quality in the project.
And the last element of our project is really the flying green. I think in this we are really creating land in the sky. We thought that with this kind of density, if every unit was to contribute a certain amount to an overall pool, you can actually own something much bigger than what you could. So in this case, we thought that by connecting all the mechanical and electrical spaces together, we could then compress the need for these spaces, then giving them back to the communal spaces. And I think we created in total 2 hectares of new green that is literally reclaimed from the air and threaded through the block. I think this idea of combining bridges and buildings was the key idea that was picked up by the judges of the competition. At that time was Fumiko Maki and Mozi Shafdi. And we then thought that the level 26 could be a quieter, for residents only kind of recreational space, and the 50th floor could be then the public park. And the bridges themselves was very, very challenging. We had to create trial assemblies off-site. This is in a steel factory that is in Malaysia, in Johor, which is then brought back to the site and then stacked one on top of the other, and then jacked up in place. So a great level of control had to be set. There was only a 50 mm tolerance in the hoisting up. The first 2 sets of bridges took extremely long, but subsequent ones miraculously got in place much easier. And I think when the last bridge was installed, this one incidentally is heavier than the entire Boeing 747, and is one of the heaviest bridges to span 2 buildings. And this is the end result. A bridge right in the air with outdoor gyms and stargazing pods, children's playground, 800-meter jogging track up in the air, little outdoor spaces for you to run away from your mother or mother-in-law. And this is the top of the hill. So that little plate there actually brings that top of the hill to like 3 meters higher than the highest hill, natural hill in Singapore. So we are like the new metaphorical architectural mountain. We thought that, instead of going for a run to Bukit Timah, you could come up to this space here. And that blue patch is what we dreamt of, a little pond or a little lake up in the air, but being public housing, there was very tight control of water in the public spaces, and this became like an artistic interpretation of our desires. It's actually a rubber patch for children to play in. And this is the Pinnacle at Duxton. I think the striking thing about this project is that it is actually public housing. In some countries, you call it the social housing. It's subsidized housing for the people, and it's meant to be affordable housing and as a model for rejuvenation of the city center, as a model for future connectivity, connected or network tall building systems. I think this is a project that I think gives us or creates an imagination, and I think the possibility of this being replicated on a sort of larger scale manner actually makes this a project that we should study and look at, and this is exactly what the HDB is looking at, examining what happens to the people who live there. And I think Belinda and I are both very proud to be able to be involved in this project. So thank you very much for listening.